Hello and welcome to the Geeky Brummie YouTube channel. Today we'll be building our new audio and video editing workstation. This will comprise of a Ryzen 5 3600 processor, Gigabyte RTX 2060 graphics card, MSI B550 Tomahawk motherboard, 32 gigabytes of DDR 3200 speed RAM, 2 PCIe NVMe storage drives, all in this Vantex P400A case. You can get all these parts from box.co.uk, the link will be in the description below. Before I take you into the build, I've got a few items which I've prepared, which I think most people should prepare if they're planning to build a PC. The first up is my anti-static mat here and anti-static wrist strap. What you can do with these, make life really simple, plug your power supply in, straight into the wall. Make sure it's switched off at the wall, however, but this will then provide you a ground connection, which you can put your anti-static wrist strap on. And then you can either put this on any kind of skin, so you can put this on a wrist or an ankle, just to give yourself grounding. I've also got some magnetic trays here, so these are for keeping all my screws and bits tidy. I use 3, all magnetic, so really easy to sort, keep together. I'll have a Windows 10 USB key. And the whole point of that is it's Windows 10 installation is already preloaded on there. USB 3, so it'll be a really quick installation when we come around to installing Windows onto the PC itself. And for tools, I've got one long handled screwdriver and IFIXIT MAHI toolkit here with all the bits we should need. The first step in any PC build is usually the motherboard, because this is where most of your components will slot into. We're using an MSI MAG B550 Tomahawk motherboard, which is the latest B550 chipset from AMD. This gives PCI generation 4 for our graphics going forward, and also has super fast storage with PCI Gen 4 NVMe SSDs. We're not using a PCI Gen 4 NVMe SSD today, mainly due to the cost. This is very new technology, it's quite expensive, but this has 2 NVMe slots, and we'll be using our 2 M.2 slots for our main storage on our system. So included in our motherboard box is the motherboard itself, as you'll find here. You'll usually find a few extra little things that they've thrown in. So for example, MSI have thrown in a case badge, a couple of SATA cables, a driver disc which is completely out of date by the time you open the box, a few little bits here, more stuff. There'll be spare M.2 SATA screws, so pop that in there. You'll have your quick installation guide and your full manual. So we'll be taking these out to refer to in case we need to as part of our build. The rest of the stuff can pop back in there. If you haven't got an anti-static surface, a great thing you can do is use your motherboard box to put your motherboard on. That way it keeps it off the table. Make sure there's no anti-static, as the cardboard will not transmit any electricity or generate an extra electrostatic shock. When handling your motherboard, try and be as careful as possible to not touch any of the traces on the PCB itself. This might cause a little bit of damage due to the oils in your skin, so try and use the edges or touch on plastic components or metal components where possible. So the vast majority of our build is going to be done on the motherboard itself. We can install the processor, our 2 M.2 SSDs, and then get that ready to put into the case. These 2 brackets here installed onto the motherboard we're not going to be using today, because we have an aftermarket cooler, and these were designed for the first generation of Ryzen CPUs with the latch on. So what we can do is take these off. I recommend you putting these back in your motherboard box in case you need to RMA this, and then you know where they are to return. Now we're going to install our processor. This is, as I mentioned, the Ryzen 3600 from AMD, Ryzen 5, latest generation as of current, and this is a very nice and fast little processor. It is 6 cores with 12 threads, so plenty of processing power for editing our audio and video. In the processor box, you'll usually have the processor itself off to one side in a handy tray with the sticker, and in this example, as with most Ryzen processors, there is a cooler. So this is the standard race stealth CPU cooler that comes with the processor. It's not a bad processor at all if you're planning on running it at stock speeds or you're not doing massively intensive work, as this will be running quite hot on our CPU. What we're going to do is replace this cooler with an aftermarket one. So lift up the retention arm on this. What this does, because this is a pin grid array processor instead of a land green array processor. This then frees those slots up to put in our Ryzen CPU, and which should have 0 insertion force. What you'll need to know is you'll have to have a look onto here. There'll be a tiny little arrow in one of the corners, or usually indicated with a little mark here, and that lines up on the CPU itself as to where to install it. There'll be a tiny little dot in one of the corners on your CPU, which is just here on this one. So that lines up with the slot on there, and it should just drop straight in without any effort. Again, very careful with the CPU, handle it on the sides, and don't try and get your fingers onto the internal heat spreader. So that should drop in just like that, no force whatsoever, and then you re-import the retention arm. For this PC, we're using an aftermarket cooler. This is the Cooler Master Hyper 212 RGB Black Edition. It's been around for quite some time. It's a very well-renowned air cooler. We're not going with liquid cool on this, just for the slight risk that there might be a leak in the system, where we don't want any system downtime on this, because this will be for our editing. Before installing our cooler, however, we'll get the rest of the smaller components onto the motherboard. Next up is our Kingston HyperX 32 gigs of DDR3200 RAM, which is the HyperX Fury line. This is the RGB one, so we'll pop these into the motherboard. Now, most memory nowadays runs in what's known as dual channel mode. This is to give a little bit of a speed performance across having two separate lanes on the RAM. So what we do is we choose two slots. They shouldn't be the slots next to each other. They should be leaving at least one gap. Take slots 2 and 4. This will give you a maximum clearance from your CPU cooler, and also allows a bit of breathing space for if you want to upgrade in the future. So it should take very little effort to put in your RAM. Depending on your motherboard, some will have one fixed side and a loose side, which is what is on this one, but some will have two clips on either side, which you just need to release off. So next, it's time to install our two M.2 NVMe SSDs. What you need to do is get these two internal heatsinks off, which are built into the motherboard. Should just be nice and easy. Two little screws, unscrew like that, and that just lifts off out the way. And you'll see we've got spacing for multiple sizes of M.2 in here, which is 2210, 2260, 2280. We've got two NVMe SSDs for this one, both from ADATA. They're the XPG XX8200 Pro, one 256GB one for our operating system, and one 512GB one. This will be more for our scratch disk when we're editing large video files or large audio files. So these ones here have their separate little heat spreader if you want to put that one in. There'll be a key which you will line up on here. So this one has a little key on the side. You can also use these slots for SATA 60GB drives in the M.2 format. These aren't as fast, so if you're not looking for super speed, they will be much cheaper. So recommended you go with those if you're looking for a slightly more budget system. But it should just be a case of popping this drive out, lining that up with the key, pop in like that and drop down. Now 2280 is the box standard size for most drives. You'll see here we've got a tiny little screw hole here. The screws that came with our motherboard earlier, we'll need one of those to just pop into here and retain that into the motherboard. So these are really tiny screws, so you want to be quite careful with them. But it should just be a case of very light pressure, just hand tight. That's now retained in. That'll hold it in place. And as this motherboard has integrated heat spreaders into it, what we can do is just take this cover off the thermal pad. Again, just hand tight should be fine on this, and just make sure you line up on both screws. And what that'll do is spread the heat. When this PC is on, these drives are known to run a little bit hot, so just keep an eye on that. So that is our operating system SSD installed. To move on to the second drive, slight issue with these motherboards is this and these two share the same lanes. So if you're installing an NVMe SSD in here, this disables these two PCIe ports. We still have a spare PCIe 1, and you'll have your PCIe E4 here, which runs directly from the processor. This is one for your graphics card. So if you're not putting too many expansion cards in, which most people won't, you won't actually need these two extra ones. So we're sacrificing these two slots to have the second M.2 drive. This Cooler Master CPU cooler comes with its own retention bracket, which you'll have to use to replace the standard one that comes on most motherboards. Depending on your choice of aftermarket CPU cooler, if you're using the standard, this one just comes with a slightly different one. Now remember never to over tighten things like this, because you'll need a little bit of wiggle room when installing the CPU cooler. So it's now time to apply our thermal paste. Just a small P size or an X, or dependent on your method of applying, a little P in the center should be more than plenty. Always remember to tidy as you go along, just because it's going to make life so much easier for you in the long run. Some systems allow you to mount your CPU either way, that way or that way. This one from Cooler Master, the Hyper 212, it's just going to be that way only. You should have good contact with the CPU. So what we're going to do now is start tightening our 4 mounting points. Ideally, half a turn each, just so you can get the right level. And keep going around until you feel a little bit of resistance. You don't want to over tighten these, because that might damage your CPU. That is now nice, tightly on, and you should be able to lift up the entire motherboard by the CPU cooler. You can now reinstall our fan. So you have an option here where you can have it push-pull. As this fan is set up that the exhaust is on the rear of the clips, just fire it in like that, and then just put it on the retention clips. Hopefully, depending on your cooler, there should be enough space for retention. Like that. Now the fan is installed, you can reroute your cables. So dependent on your motherboard type, you might have an RGB cable point. So we can check with this motherboard here, and CPU heatsink, what RGB type it is, and this will be in the manual. If you have too much slack on your CPU fan cable, just tie a little knot in it, and that will really shorten it down. This can now go into our first CPU fan slot on the motherboard. If your CPU fan has RGB installed, you should be able to just drop this in, depending on your connectivity. Again, always a good idea to tidy as you go along. Makes your life so much easier at the end of the process. At this point in the build, we've pretty much done as much as we possibly can putting this motherboard together before it goes into our case. So we'll be moving on here, taking this motherboard away and setting our case up. Our case of choice for today's build is the Phanteks P400A. So this is a mid-tower. It's got space for either MATX or ATX motherboards. Reason I really like this case is all the nice little touches that you have with it. So we get 3 RGB fans down the front here. We get a PSU shroud to keep our power supply out of the way. Nice big cutout in case we need to get the back plate of our motherboard. Space for multiple drives here. And nice little grommets to keep our cables nice and tidy. We've also got extra space up the top and down the side for extra cooling fans, which we will be installing some more of. On the back side, again, really nicely done. All the cables are tidied up here. The accessories box for the actual case comes in one of the little 3.5-inch mounting bays. It's a nice little touch here. Space for 2 SSDs here in 2.5-inch. Got a dust filter down here for our power supply. Really nicely designed, really nice and tidy, and I really recommend it. The front is all mesh, so there's no filters underneath the mesh. This mesh is fine enough that it will act as a filter itself, keeping the PC nice and clean. On the top here, we've got space here for our front audio, 2 USB 3 ports, power on and off button, and underneath there is the reset button. If you're not using a motherboard RGB controls, there is a on-off button and a multiple choice flick switch here, and again another dust shield on the top here, which easily removable, easily cleanable. So now I'm just going to install the additional fans that we purchased for this case. Again, these are RGB. You can find multiple retailers online, but this is just to give us a little bit more airflow, keep the PC cool, considering that we're using this as a workstation. We're fitting all three of our fans as exhaust. Nice easy way to tell on most case fans is that'll be your intake and that'll be exhaust where all the blades are. So that should really just a nice easy way to know which way your fans are blowing. If we were going water cooling, one of the other options we'd have had on this case as well is that we could have gone with having a radiator mounted at the top or at the front for our AIO cooler, or if we were doing hardline water cooling. Alright, we've now installed our extra fans on top, so we have this rat's nest of cables now to sort out. So that is going to be my next job, is to plug all these into the fan controller. So our fan controller is now installed. It's a little bit messy at the back here due to multiple RGB cables, but this has support for up to 7 fans, which all runs off the SATA power, and then we can sync directly to our motherboard, which would be quite nice. And 3 front fans are also synced up to here, and we'll power these off the SATA too. So now we're ready to put our motherboard in. So we're quite lucky with our choice of motherboard because it has an integrated I/O shield. Quite a few motherboards don't have those, so you'll have to put your I/O shield in beforehand, which can be quite fiddly. This centre post here sticks up a little bit further than the other centre post, so it really helps you be able to centre your motherboard properly so you know exactly where you're going in. Also worth double checking to make sure that all the mounting holes are in the right spots for your motherboard. Most motherboards will have 9 mounting slots when it's a full ATX size board, so just double check that and that there's no extras underneath where there could be issues. So that's all lined up now. So next job is to mount the motherboard with the included motherboard screws. I used to do centre post first, then work around diagonally, make sure it's all nice and seated and not going too weird. Motherboard screws usually look like this, so there'll be a tiny little bit of thing at the top and enough there, but always worth double checking to make sure that you've got the right ones in case they've got mixed up or you have additional fan screws. This is when it really helps to have a long handled screwdriver, because some of the screws are going to be really difficult to get into, especially at the back of the case, so just keep an eye out on that. That's all our motherboard screws now inserted, so it's all nice, solid, won't move around, and it's fully grounded. Right, so now we're going to do the front panel connectors. Always worth double checking the motherboard. For this one, for example, if you're going off here JFP1, it tells you where's your power LED, your power switch, your HDD LED, and your reset switch will go. Some motherboards will differ. Always worth double checking in the manual. Right now, so a lot of people have a choice here. They'll either install the power supply or the hard drives. I'm going to install the hard drives just because they're easy to put in the case, out of the way, don't need to worry about them too much. You'll have your SSD mounts here, so I'll take this tray off, put our SSD on here, so that's out of the way, and put our two 3.5 inch mechanical drives in there. Now, SSDs aren't as bad as old style mechanical drives where you need to be very careful about moving them and retaining them. Some people will just use double-sided tape. I use one screw either side. That's now fitted securely. That's not going to move around inside the case. And then with these brackets, just push it back in and then you're in. For this case, our two mechanical drives will fit in these sleds and just slot straight into this retaining mechanism here. That's securely now slipped into the sled, and then it can just slot straight into this drive tray here. That's now our 2 hard drives installed. So now we can start looking at our power supply, which we had plugged in over here. And what we can now look at is what cables we're going to need to plug in. So we're going to need at least our motherboard and CPU cable. We'll need 2 PCIe cables for our power supply, and we're going to need peripheral cables such as our SATA cables. So we'll use the Geeky cables from modular power supply in nice little baggies. It helps you tell what stuff's apart, and easy enough to work out what's going in where. As we have an intake on the bottom, I'll be mounting this PSU bottom side down to draw fresh air in and exhaust out the back without interfering with any of the other airflow in the case. Our PSU is mounted, it's now time to run all the cabling. Good place to start off is always with the motherboard, power supply, and double check your side to see where it's coming through. So it'll be coming through this top grommet here. Our CPU 8-pin connector is right at the back of the case in this corner here, so that's where that one will need to go. So that's all our rear cabling done. Not the neatest job, I know, but when you put down your back plate, you're not going to see this at all. Just make sure it's all clipped in all the way down. And none of the catches are loose. Might take you a couple of tries, especially with the amount of cables that we have underneath. And then just tie them with your thumb screws. Nice and neat, all done. And now we're down to our final step, which is adding our SATA cables and installing our GPU and sound card. So with most of them, like this MATX case, you'll have multiple PCIe cover slots, so just make sure they line up with the ones that you want to remove and try not to drop the screws onto the motherboard. So this will be where our sound card is going, and these 2 slots here will be where our GPU is going. So our sound card is the Sound Blaster AUDIGY FX. It's low priced for a single PCIe 1 sound card, but it will be much better than our onboard audio, which comes with most motherboards, which is a Realtek driver. As I mentioned earlier, our front panel audio connector is actually on the PCIe card itself, so that's what we'll be plugging directly in. And the pin out will tell you which way it's to go. So that's our front panel audio in. And that is our PCIe sound. And the final part of our build, our graphics card, which we've chosen the Gigabyte GeForce RTX 2060, which is ray tracing GDDR5 and DirectX 12 ready. And it comes pre-overclocked out of the box. And don't forget to remove the GPU PCIe cover. And the last thing is our PCIe power. You'll notice these are different to the CPU ones. The CPU ones will have a 4+4 connector, whereas these have a 6+2. So they will just clip together like that to make your 8 block if needed. And one nice thing to do, grab a cable tie. You can just hide this underneath nice and neatly like that. Just makes the system look that little bit better when you're putting it all back together. So that is pretty much it complete now for the build. What we'll do next is grab our monitor, our keyboard and mouse, and have a test boot. Right, so it is time for our first test boot. USB key in ready for Windows 10 preload, and then we'll just have our first boot now and see what goes. So you might see it boot a few times to start off with. That'll just be to clear any CMOS settings that are in there. Just start identifying the components. So here we go, we're in now. I just run through that again, and we just need to go into the BIOS, which is usually the delete key. So we'll need to run the setup for the first time. So here we are, we're in. This is our Ryzen 3600. Our RAM is actually running slower at the moment because it's running at 2400, so what we'll need to do is go into our XMP profile settings and get those all set up. So if you usually just click XMP move profile, that'll usually pick up your RAM speed. So you can see here we've got our 32 gigs of RAM. All our storage is showing, so we've got our Western Digital 2 500 gig drives, 256 boot drive NVMe, our 512 gig scratch drive, and our 408 gig extra USB here. You can see here in our fan settings we've got a system fan and CPU fan. And you can go through and set your fan sorts how you want it to. You can also check your power draw, your chipset, everything else on here. So now we're enabled this XMP, we can reset and go straight back to the BIOS. Now we'll just go through Windows setup, which will be the first time. Just pop the Windows key in from wherever you purchase it. There's lots of online sellers where you can get Windows 10 now. I won't go through it all for you. So now, just installing Windows. As we're running from USB 3 from the front port, this should be really fast. Right. Windows nowadays gives you lots and lots of options where you can dial home and track back. So I won't be using a lot of those. So turn off online voice recognition, turn off location access, find my device. You might want to use find your device, especially on a laptop or a small PC. That's slightly easier to steal. Basic diagnostics. Don't want inking and typing because we're not using a tablet with this. No tailored ads, and definitely turn off your advertising ID. What you might have noticed there's monitor flickered on and off. That's because usually now with NVIDIA graphics cards, there's inbuilt Windows drivers, so they might update and get the right screen resolution for you before you're ready to go. And then basically just keep turning off all the features that you don't want. So like Android phone, if you're not wanting to use your Android phone to dial with that, or OneDrive, you can turn all of this off. They're all optional, so you can reinstall them afterwards if you need to. After that's done, it'll reboot again, and then you should be able to get into the Windows desktop. Next thing to do, download all your Windows updates, install your drivers, flash your BIOS for your motherboard if needed, but I'll leave it there because I think it's a successful build. One last thing to do is we shut down the PC, and now we can finally install our tempered glass side panel. The final step in our build is now done. We've installed our tempered glass side panel. Really hope you've enjoyed watching the build process today. Next time we'll be looking at doing a few benchmarks, comparing this to our old laptop that we had from 5 years ago, which was our main editing PC, and just see how much we've improved. Don't forget to check out box.co.uk. If you don't want to go through the process of building your own PC, they also have a Cube PCs which you can check through box.co.uk. Specification of this is all there. They can build you a very similar system. They've got 20 years worth of experience. Really good guys, and recommend you go and check them out, and a link will be in the description below. Thanks very much for watching. Don't forget to check out our other social media channels and our podcast every other Saturday.